Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our event, Moving Target, Getting Ahead of Kremlin Aggression. It is with great enthusiasm that I welcome our speakers, Mr. Conrad Muzeka and Mr. Alex Tiersky. Michael Sawkiw, representative from the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America, will be our moderator today, and Karen Shui from the Estonian National Council will be moderating questions and answers in the chat function. We regret that Elisabeth Braw was not able to join us today due to last-minute change in her travel plans, but she shared with us her recorded remarks, which you will see momentarily. Elisabeth Braw is a journalist and defense analyst. She's currently a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where she specializes in the challenges of rising national security threats, particularly in the form of hybrid and gray zone warfare. She's also a columnist for foreign policy, where she writes on national security and the global economy. She's widely published across many publications in Europe and the United States. She's also the author of God's Spies, the Stasi's Cold War espionage campaign inside the church, which uncovers how the East German regime infiltrated Christian churches during the 40 years of its power. Please watch Elisabeth Braw's recorded remarks.
Hello, everybody. I'm sorry I couldn't participate in person. I had a flight change, which meant that I will be in the air as you meet. But I'm delighted that you are meeting and that you're interested in new national security threats, which is clearly a fast growing area of concern for liberal democracies in Europe and beyond. But in Europe, the problem goes far beyond the disinformation that people have been talking about now for years, disinformation stemming from Russia and being targeted against various European countries with the intent of harming, poisoning, distorting that public discourse. That is a huge challenge, but it's not particularly new. That's been going on for a number of years now. And obviously, if you ask people in the Baltic states, they'll say it has been going on ever since they regained independence. So it's not particularly new. We have been seeing an increase in recent years, but what's newer is the innovation in national security threats coming from Russia, but of course, increasingly from Belarus as well. And that is the most acute situation at the moment, Belarus's aggression against Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland, involving the weaponization of migrants. And that illustrates that tactic by Belarus illustrates how much you can achieve as an aggressor in the gray zone between war and peace by using means that are either completely unpalatable to the other side, so they would never use them, or by using means that no other country had previously thought of, and certainly that the targeted countries hadn't thought of defending themselves against. And this is, of course, a challenge. How, as a liberal democracy, can you defend yourself against every single offensive action that the other side might come up with, and not just come up with, but undertake? So that is the challenge. While Belarus has been engaging in weaponization of migrants, Russia has been rather more silent, not silent, rather more quiet than usual. But we should remember that Russia isn't, and also we should say that Russia has also been rather quiet compared to China, which has been on the offensive recently, not least with hostage diplomacy and coercion of Western companies, or coercion using Western companies. So Russia, I think that the challenge is the challenge is always to figure out what Russia might try next, and it's so easy to predict something that they've already done. And how can you predict something they haven't already done? That again is a challenge. But while we're trying to figure out what our next move is, we should think about, we should look after the areas where we know it's already active, Russia is already active, and that involves, of course, the continuing use of disinformation. But also, we should think about, instead of trying to identify what Russia will do next, we should think about what we can do on our side to create more resilience against whatever Russia comes up with next. And the resilience that we create shouldn't just be targeted, or shouldn't just be about one particular area. Resilience is sort of a state of mind, or state of affairs, or a state of readiness. So resilience, societal resilience, is a state of readiness across society. So with the goal that whatever the disruption is that comes your way, it will have limited effect. And that's, I think, where we can do a lot as liberal democracies. We can't predict what the other side is going to do next. We can't necessarily stop it, although we should obviously signal to Russia that there will be consequences. And if you're interested in what else can be done, I cover this in my new book called The Defender's Dilemma: Identifying and Deterring Gray Zone Aggression. But at the most basic level is to increase societal resilience by making sure that every part of society is involved in trying to keep society safe. So I leave you with this thought: don't try to predict what Russia is going to do next. We will inevitably fail because Putin and his advisors are clearly very innovative. And if we always only match our efforts to the specific form of disruption or aggression that the other side engages in, then we will always we'll always be one step behind. We'll always be trying to catch up, and the sort of measures that we come up with are invariably going to be directed against the wrong acts of aggression by that country. And so, how do we involve the rest of society? Again, I would have loved to participate live in the discussion and to highlight more what can be done. But suffice it to say that I think unlike military aggression, which is it's not a likely prospect. We should always prepare for it, but because it's not a likely prospect, people don't really see the need to take it seriously. But with this form of aggression, not only is it likely, it's already there. And I think that's the basis on which we can involve the population, because they see it, they know it's happening in their countries, and they want they want for their lives to be as unaffected as possible by this, and because we all want a convenient lifestyle. So everybody, companies, governments, and the wider population have an interest, I think, in trying to limit the effects of this aggression that is taking place. And with this, I wish you a good discussion, and I hope to participate next time.
To those remarks, if you'd like to go ahead and watch those afterwards. I mean, her highlights were basically that, disinformation is nothing new, but what's new is the innovations that, the national security threats coming our way from Russia and now Belarus, which is also, very acute in their weaponization of migrants, is a new thing for us to deal with. And what's happening now is sort of, it illustrates how the Kremlin and others are coming up with things that are unpalatable to other countries, or that nobody would have even thought of doing, and therefore not defending against either. So the best thing we can do is, we're never going to be able to predict what might come next. If we try to do that, we'll always be one step behind. But what we can do is create more resilience in our societies to whatever comes next, so that whatever that is will have a more limited effect. So those were the high points that I got out of that, if that helps sort of frame. And it certainly was not put as she did. So I do invite you guys to watch the video when you get a chance. But with that, let's go ahead and move on with our discussion. Over to you, Michael.
Karen, thank you. Thank you very much. And again, we do apologize for the technical difficulties. This is, I guess, the modern world as we see it today, especially during pandemic times with webinars and technical issues. So again, we do apologize. As introduced earlier by my colleague Klara and Karen, my name is Michael Sawkiw. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America, the central representative organization of the Ukrainian American community. And welcome to our fourth in a series webinar, briefing sessions of the Central and East European Coalition. Today's webinar, entitled Moving Target, Getting Ahead of Kremlin Aggression, will look at the bigger picture of hybrid aspects of Russia's aggression in Central and Eastern Europe. It is truly an honor to have assembled a star-studded panel of experts, one of which you have already heard in her video remarks and presentation, who will provide their perspective and analysis of Kremlin policies in a very important region of the world. But before we begin, let's take a look at the context of current events and activities, just some of the current events or some of the activities in Central and East Europe. The recent Zapad 2021 Russian exercises in Belarus, the building of Russian troops on Ukraine's border, the NATO summit and President Biden's meeting with Vladimir Putin in June of 2021, the infamous Nord Stream 2 political pipeline, and the strategic objective of this 3Cs initiatives. We will hear from our panelists and seek their counsel and policy recommendations for combating the various realms of Kremlin aggression. So therefore now let me introduce our panelists. Our first panelist is Conrad Muzeka. Konrad Muzeka is an experienced independent defense analyst and the director of Rochan Consulting, a Polish-based defense firm that provides consultancy services on the Russian and Belarusian military capabilities and objectives in East Central European region. In addition, Mr. Muzeka has years of experience working for the global defense intelligence company Janes, where he works and served as a military capabilities analyst. Mr. Muzeka has been published extensively. His most recent work concerns the Zapad 2021 military exercises and what it reveals about the development of Russian and Belarusian military structure, capabilities, and objectives in the region. Alex Tiersky is a national security and foreign affairs expert with extensive experience in policy analysis, with particular areas of focus including transatlantic relations, arms control, diplomatic operations, and foreign policy legislation. Over the course of nearly 2 decades, Mr. Tiersky has worked for the Department of State, Capitol Hill, NATO, the nonprofit sector in the United States and abroad. Between 2004 and 2006, he served at the US Department of State, where he helped form policy on NATO security, nuclear arms in Europe, and NATO-Russia relations. He currently is the senior policy advisor, podcast host, and global security and political military affairs advisor for the US Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe, better known as the Helsinki Commission. So now we will hear brief remarks from our experts. And this is a reminder to our audience members, please note that all questions and to our experts are to be submitted in the question and answer function below in this chat, in the question and answer function below. Thank you. And now to our experts, I think we will commence with Konrad Muzeka. Mr. Muzeka.
Yes, thank you very much for this invitation. As already stated, I'll be talking about Zapad, which I had been watching for closely. But before I go there, there are some important caveats. First of all, Zapad is not just the active phase of the exercise that took place between 10th and 16th of September. Preparations for the drill last for several months and include a myriad of other smaller scale, both military and civilian exercises. So for the sake of this presentation, I'm going to be talking about long Zapad, which is which is all the activities that fall into the short Zapad, which is the active phase of the drill. Secondly, my presentation will mostly focus on the long Zapad, and there are two reasons for that. First of all, I did a day-to-day analysis of the short Zapad with Michael Kaufman on his blog, so there is, I think, no need for me to repeat what's written there. And secondly, if we are interested in how Russia goes to war, how it force generates new units, how it moves these units, how it generally plans to commence combat operations, then we should be looking at the long Zapad. Okay, now briefly, Zapad essentially tests Russian warfighting capabilities in the Western operational direction, and therefore it has a strong anti-NATO character. That has always been the case, that's no surprise. The main goal of the exercise is to test how the joint Russian-Belarusian regional grouping of forces would fare against NATO-led forces and everything that comes with them. So we are looking at submarines, strategic bomber aircraft, essentially high end of the spectrum, highly technical, highly technically advanced opposing forces. Zapad tends to deliver war scares. That was clearly seen 4 years ago, with numerous concerns raised about a potential Russian attack on Belarus or the Baltic states, although in reality there was no indication that Russia was preparing an armed attack on any of its neighbors, including Belarus. In 2017, Russian forward elements started arriving to Belarus about 2-3 weeks before the active phase kicked off, and Russia deployed battalion tactical groups to Belarus as well. These are very highly maneuverable formations. However, they are too small and they have insufficient firepower for the conduct of high tempo operations against NATO forces. Or in other words, Russia is unlikely, highly unlikely, I would say, to go to war with NATO using BTGs as the primary combat formations. Instead, it will deploy regiments, brigades, and divisions as the main breakthrough force of NATO defenses so that they can quickly obtain tactical and operational successes. Now, the context for this year's Zapad was very different. In March, the Russian armed forces began what I think are the largest mobility exercise in its history that was not directly connected to any ongoing military operations. Within a space of a few weeks, Moscow forward deployed a sizable part of the 41st Combined Arms Army and at least one battalion tactical group from the 90th Tank Division to Pogonovo, south of Voronezh. Simultaneously, airborne units and BTGs from the 58th Combined Arms Army were deployed to the Opuk training range in Crimea. So essentially what we had in terms of Russian posturing in late March, early April, was that Russia was on the surface preparing for a multi-front combat operations, possibly against Ukraine. But mid-April, Russia had elements of 4 combined arms armies deployed near Ukraine with additional airborne units sent to Crimea. Altogether, we were looking at least 20 to 25 battalion tactical groups that were forward deployed to training ranges. Now, Russia considers the period of threat to be incredibly important when it comes to its preparations for conflict with NATO forces. And the way they see it is the period of threat gives them time to actually prepare the country and the armed forces for combat operations. In the context of this year's Zapad, initial activities began in July when the lead elements of Russian First Guards Tank Army began arriving to Baranovichi and the Brest training ranges. That was 50 days before Zapad, actually, compared to 2-3 weeks in 2017. So that was a significant change compared to 2017 Zapad. By mid-August, the Russian armed forces had deployed at least 3 battalion tactical groups to Belarus, all of them from the 1st Guards Tank Army, with additional essentially units moving into Belarus until the active phase of the exercise of the short Zapad started on the 10th of September. And we also noticed that there was a lot of movement going in Russia proper itself, with a lot of units being sent to Molino training range. On the 24th of August, there was a very interesting logistics exercise in the port of Vyborg that involved border guards, customs officers, personnel from the Ministry of Emergency Situations of the Ministry of Internal Affairs and MOD Folk. As part of the drill, Russia sent T-72B3M tanks as reinforcements to the Kaliningrad Oblast. Also in August, the 1060th Material Technical Support Center of the Western Military District was quite busy distributing equipment from its storage bases to frontline units. Now, this is the district level center. It manages multiple storage facilities across the Western Military District. These sites hold warheads, missiles, tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, generally everything that Russia needs to commence combat operations and all the logistics that is needed to sustain them. Another example of Zapad preparations was the Zashita 2021 exercise, which actually involved creation of joint emergency groups that responded to various radiation hazard situations. One of them occurred at the naval base near Severodvinsk, and the other one, which also included personnel from the 27th CBRN Brigade, which responded to a radiation hazard exercise at a nuclear power plant near Kursk. Another interesting long Zapad preparation activity revolved around the National Guard, which held its own Zasłon 2021 exercise. The exercise tested the readiness of the force to neutralize threats to state and public security. Now, the National Guard, they are tasked with the provision of rear guard security, but also they can conduct kinetic operations, usually against what Russians usually called armed bandits and terrorists. In a combat scenario, they can fulfill the role of highly capable third echelon force that is tasked with controlling occupied territories and conducting low-level operations against insurgents. And lastly, there was some movement, additional force generation activity that we noticed in southern Russia. For instance, a Cossack territorial defense company of the mobilization reserve was airlifted from Rostov to Kaliningrad. The 61st Naval Infantry Brigade of the Northern Fleet was also sent to Kaliningrad as reinforcements. Another interesting activities, which are actually still ongoing, occurred in Southern Military District, actually. And they perfectly, I think, exemplify the notion that preparations, the Russian preparations for a combined arms operations against NATO will span actually across various military districts, with possibly Southern and Central Military District serving as additional force providers, such as the creation of the second echelon force. So in late August, a large number of missiles and artillery ammunitions were distributed from one of the arsenals located in the Southern MD in conditions as close to combat as possible. Simultaneously, air defense assets were busy repelling airstrike, rear services, organized support for troops deployed at training ranges and provisioned them with equipment. New command posts were also established to provide secure communications between commanders and frontline formations. As part of this exercise, Russia withdrew about 250 main battle tanks from a storage and maintenance base in Kamensk-Shakhtinsky, presumably to force generate new tank units. Combat teachings started in early September, which more or less coincided with short Zapad and involved Iskander missile strike, suppression of op force command and control channels, deployment of aerosol teams as part of BTGs to hide the movement, or generally combined arms operations with air support against superior forces. The active phase ended on the 18th of September and involved at least 10,000 ground force personnel, which is about 12 battalion tactical groups, plus additional soldiers from the Black Sea Fleet and the Caspian Flotilla. So as you can see, the scale of preparations for the short Zapad was very big, and it was basically going on for 2 months. And these exercises sought to prepare various government agencies and the armed forces for war, not against terrorists, but against highly capable state-based forces. When it comes to the short Zapad, the active phase of the drill, usually it is divided into 2 major episodes. The one is defensive, which aims to stop NATO's ground attack on Belarus and sustain the first wave of air attacks on joint forces. Forward deployed forces are further strengthened by other formations coming in from Russia, most notably by airborne forces, which fulfill quick reaction roles and which are deployed to the most threatened areas of the front. At the same time, defending forces conduct the so-called maneuvered defense that include counterattacks along selected axes to disrupt NATO's offensive operation. The second episode is primarily driven by counteroffensive operations and the plan to retake previously captured territory and the destruction of the enemy. The escalation is both horizontal and vertical, and it includes additional forces being deployed into the front line and the opening of new axes, whereas the Air Force is employed to strike NATO's rear to disrupt its operations. From open source intelligence perspective, I think Zapad will be analyzed for the next few months, at least specifically in terms of scenarios that were practiced, possible changes in the Russian doctrine and the scale of the exercises, the exercises' impact on the Russo-Belarusian defense relationship. Yet I think some initial conclusions can be drawn based on press reports. First of all, obviously, Russia considers NATO to be its primary threat in the West. The European Union actively seeks to undermine the Belarusian political system, and it's seeking to conduct a regime change in Belarus. Consequently, Russia will protect its political military interests in Belarus and will resort to force deployments if these are necessary. Although it is a truism that Russia relies on rail transport for the movement of its ground formations, Zapad and everything that happened around it has shown that Russia is able to maintain a large part of its forces in the Western military direction, essentially for as long as it's necessary. Elements of the 41st Combined Arms Army were deployed at Pogonovo, south of Voronezh, until a few days ago. I actually checked satellite imagery today, and I noticed that the site was finally being emptied, which unfortunately raises another question: where are these forces going? And we do not know yet. Now, it's also clear that Russia could maintain a very sizable force deployment in Belarus, for instance, very similar to the one it had at Pogonovo, should such agreement be reached between Moscow and Minsk. Which leads to a larger issue revolving around logistics support. For Russia, Belarus serves as a main forward deployed logistics hub. The country hosts around 30 storage facilities, which provide everything that is needed for the conduct of military operations against NATO. I can talk about it actually later during the Q&A. the Belarusian armed forces are not expected to conduct independent operations, perhaps with the exception of special operation forces, and the ground forces will only fight as a part of a larger Russia-led grouping. One interesting element that I think was missing from this year's Zapad was a lack of a nuclear element. In 2017, there was a large strategic rocket forces dispersal drill and 2 ICBM launches around Zapad. This year, nothing of that sort took place, which is quite interesting. Does it tell us something that, you know, we are not sure yet to what extent Russia believes that a conflict termination can only occur with conventional forces, and that you know, it does not need to resort to nuclear strike to bring out the conflict termination. And I think that's it from my side.
Thank you, Konrad. That was quite a very interesting presentation, lots of information as well. I've taken as many notes as I could. So I will have a few questions in the question and answer period, but looking forward to Alex's presentation. Alex, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you for the invitation to be here, both to you and your colleagues. The first thing I want to say is I found Konrad's presentation so impressive in terms of the scale and scope of Zapad, and it brought me back to some mischief that I got up to when I first joined the Helsinki Commission about 5 years ago, not very long before the last Zapad. And little did I know when joining the commission here on Capitol Hill that I would shortly be sent to Belarus to actually watch the hot phase, or I would say the short Zapad of 2017. And Konrad, I wish I'd had you with me. So, yeah, I probably would have understood a lot better what I was seeing had you been by my side. So thank you for that presentation. Look, before getting into the meat of my points, I just wanted to start with a few words about who it is I represent for our audience. Those of you who know the Helsinki Commission well already know that the Commission is composed of a bicameral, bipartisan group of senators and members of the House, 18 in all, currently under the chairmanship of Senator Ben Cardin of Maryland. Now, while I am, of course, speaking in my personal capacity here, what I always say about my job is it's one of the greatest jobs on Capitol Hill for a million different reasons, but probably the most important one is the deep and enduring consensus among our members on the main lines of what they believe that's pertinent to this conversation. Number one, that the threat from Russia is very much real. Number two, that our friends and partners deserve and require our support, both for their own sake as well as for the sake of the international order. And three, that United States leadership on these issues is absolutely critical. So if you take nothing else away from my set of points here, please remember that bipartisan consensus may be increasingly rare, but on this set of issues, at least, I'm here to tell you it's absolutely real. So the first kind of set of thoughts I wanted to offer is what is the strategic level problem, zooming out from Zapad a little bit and bouncing back to Michael's initial introduction, how do we see the problem here on Capitol Hill, at least the members that I work for? I think the starting point is that, as you heard in Konrad's presentation and in Michael's introduction, I think the illusion that maybe was harbored in some cases about the possibility that Russia might be, quote unquote, parked in order for the United States to focus on other areas of geostrategic interest. We've had some real reminders of why that won't work in recent months. And Zapad was one example. I think also that has been mentioned is the massive military buildup in March and April in and around Ukraine. Also, just the fact of Russia's continuing military modernization, the buildup of forces in the Western military district that I think has gone quite well described, into a very well-equipped force of some 200,000. The continued militarization of Crimea, additional forces and capabilities flowing into Kaliningrad. All of these things are concerning. Of course, I could also speak to Russia's increasingly assertive behavior in the Black Sea, its efforts essentially to create a Russian lake out of the Black Sea. And that says, that goes double for the Russian blockading of the Sea of Azov and some of Ukraine's most important ports. Of course, it has to be mentioned, I think this audience is well aware, but it has to be mentioned at every opportunity that the continued war in Ukraine that Russia is waging cannot be forgotten. It is nothing like a frozen conflict. It is very much a hot war in which more than 14,000 have lost their lives and more than 1.5 million have been displaced, and that Ukrainians are suffering from this war on a daily basis, to say nothing of the flagrant human rights violations that pertain to the ongoing occupation of Crimea, for example. So I also, of course, need to mention that our members are very much cognizant of other examples of Russian geostrategic behavior, including the continued occupation of some 20% of the territory of the country of Georgia. We could talk about Russian troops in Moldova. We could talk about their role in the Caucasus. In summary, I guess what I would say is the members that I work for recognize clearly that these are the tendrils of an aggressive revisionist power that is continuing to seize opportunities to extend its malign influence, militarily and otherwise, through the region. I would also say the Kremlin is creating opportunities for future action, including using techniques such as passportization, in which, for example, Ukrainians are incentivized to acquire Russian passports as a pretext to putatively come to their defense, quote unquote, on some future occasion. So what are we doing about it? How do we see the efforts of pushing back, essentially? Well, I think the first set of measures that we need to ensure are in place are holding the line and addressing the defenses, shoring up the defenses of NATO allies to a point where they present a credible deterrent. And I would argue that, broadly speaking, since 2014, we've done fairly well there. NATO's enhanced forward presence, additional US forces in the region, increased defense spending from our European NATO partners, allies, our training in the European theater, which is fairly robust. And I think it does matter that the executive branch, to a great extent, is providing the kind of rhetorical support that is necessary, I think, to the good health of the alliance. You see measures even today at NATO headquarters in coming to the agreement for plans to address the Russian threat to the Baltics and Black Sea in particular. Could we do more here? Absolutely. Again, I think the members that I work for are very well aware that we need to remain alert to the evolution of the Russian challenge in the region. And I think you see, for example, one of our newest commissioners, Congressman Ruben Gallego, he is a co-chair of the Baltic Caucus, and I think this audience is probably well aware that he is a leader in the authorization of the Baltic Security Initiative, along with Congressman Don Bacon. And I think these are the types of funds I think that our members will continue to push for on a bipartisan basis and bicameral as well. So just a few words about NATO allies, but of course, a second and very much vital priority as well for the members that I work for is supporting our partners like Ukraine and Georgia, who I've already mentioned as being on the front lines. We need to be able to enhance bilaterally as well as multilaterally their ability to defend themselves. And I've mentioned Secretary Austin at the Defense Ministerial. Of course, this audience will know this is the last stop in what has been a trip to the region. Although I've seen in the press some critiques about the lack of specific deliverables, I would say that generally speaking, the Secretary's visit is an important signal of the administration's engagement in the region, and so I think it's a positive trip. Again, advocacy from our members is probably going to focus around areas such as bilateral security assistance to Ukraine. You all know we're going through the appropriations process now, and I think what I can say about it is, regardless of where the final numbers end up, you will see strong signaling from the Hill for an important desire to see robust funding for the key needs of Ukraine. In addition to the material assistance, you'll also see the members that I work for advocate on very important principles. And one of those is that NATO's door remain open to them, to Georgia and Ukraine. And I think that's because, you know, the rationale hasn't really changed. Not only is the future, not only is a future within the alliance a powerful incentive for these countries to continue respective reform processes, but I think we always need to defend the principle that is contained in the Helsinki Final Act, which Moscow signed up to, incidentally, that countries have a sovereign right to choose their own security alliances. This is something that you will see our members speak out on a regular basis. Now, I will remind our audience that NATO is not the only show in town in these questions. The members that I work for will tell you the OSCE is an absolutely crucial institution in which we must continually call Russia to account for its aggression. Russia, of course, is a member state, a participating state in the OSCE and has a veto. So given that it's an organization in which Russia has a veto, why should we invest time and effort at the OSCE? Well, I think this gets back to something I mentioned previously, which is the defense of the international order. This is the first reason. It's an international order that we helped build, codified in the 1975 Helsinki Final Act. Not only do we need to defend it through fora such as the OSCE, but we need to be seen to be defending it by other countries in order for it to be sustained. The second message that other countries need to see us defending is the steadfastness with which we are defending the territorial integrity of Ukraine, and that we're not ceding that space for Russian disinformation about their own culpability, for example. And then thirdly, again, as I've mentioned, this is a set of agreements that Moscow has signed up to. You will often see in Russia propaganda the idea that we are imposing external, we're inventing somehow external obligations, or that we are telling them they need to get out of Ukraine just because the United States thinks it's a good idea. Actually, that's not the case. Moscow has signed up to a set of agreements that guaranteed the territorial integrity of Ukraine, for example, and we need to hold them to those commitments. That includes, by the way, tying back to Konrad's presentation, it includes commitments on transparency and predictability in military affairs under the Vienna document. I'd be happy to talk more about that in the Q&A in the interest of time. Lastly, and hugely importantly, I don't want to overlook the fact that the OSCE is playing a hugely important role on the ground. I think most of our audience will probably be aware that the OSCE has several hundred monitors in the conflict zone reporting on ceasefire violations on a regular basis, vastly coming from the Russian-led side. And that this essentially represents the eyes and ears of the international community. And that despite the huge numbers of challenges that are put in their way, they're still able to report on some truths that are very uncomfortable, I think, for Moscow to have out in the world. I'll finally say on this issue that our members are regular participants in taking advantage of the platform that is the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, where they meet with hundreds of their counterparts from the legislatures of the the OSCE countries, including NATO countries, of course, to articulate time and again their defense of these principles and their support for our partners. Now, one of the last parts that I want to mention here is, I'm now talking about places where our members have been, I suppose, in a sense. And I guess that leads me to the idea that the travel of members of Congress is an important indication of areas in which they place significant interest. Just as I've lauded the trip of Secretary Austin, I want to alert you to some of the travel that our commissioners have been doing in this space. In particular, in July, Senators Cardin and Wicker led a congressional delegation to Bulgaria, among a number of other countries, I would say Estonia, Norway, and Austria, but they made a point to travel to Bulgaria. Number one, to participate in the 3Cs Initiative Summit. And I think what they brought there was a real sense of support to this very interesting initiative, to particularly in the energy and digital sectors, to develop infrastructure to counteract what would otherwise be open space for Russian and particularly Chinese investment. And I think it's an initiative that I think our members would very much like to see going ahead. Incidentally, I'll mention in passing, I think that was not innocent of the administration's decision on Nord Stream 2, for which there are very few fans of on Capitol Hill, speaking personally, of course. I'd also point out that on that same trip to Bulgaria, our members requested and received a briefing from the Bulgarian defense minister and chief of staff on the Black Sea, both in terms of subject and because we traveled to the Black Sea, to the city of Varna to receive that briefing. So an indication of their interest in what's going on. The last, Michael, with your permission, I do have one last important set to mention here. And I've been speaking for a while, but this is crucial. Our chairman, Senator Ben Cardin, speaks very eloquently about leading with our values and the connection between leading with our values and making a geopolitical impact. And as the chairman of the Helsinki Commission, he is regularly talking about this set of issues, which is also incidentally foundational to the concept of the OSCE of today, which is comprehensive security. Human rights, rule of law have to go together with military security. So the first principle that's germane to this conversation is that our commissioners understand the threat to Russia is largely the product of an autocratic and corrupt regime, a kleptocratic regime. From that conviction, it flows that one of the key lines of effort to support our partners against this Russian aggression is to go after that corruption directly and to promote principles of rule of law and human rights in Russia. Now, sadly, of course, dissidents, independence is continuing, the space for these things are continually shrinking in Russia, but we will continue to amplify these voices to the extent that we can. And maybe what's most innovative is the manner in which our commissioners are now leading the charge really on a whole suite of measures intended to target directly the kleptocratic system on which the Putin regime relies. This includes legislation that would introduce a number of additional sanctions, asset freezes, and other measures that would directly impact those immediately surrounding Vladimir Putin, where it would hurt the regime the most. Sorry, I've spoken maybe a bit too long. I wanted to thank you again for the invitation. And I think what I want to make sure to say as well before I give the floor back to Michael is, thank you for the opportunity for me to speak, but what's really important from my perspective here is what we hear from you all and your input, your energy, and your advocacy, which are so crucial here on Capitol Hill. Thank you for that, and thank you to the organizers for their partnership in the years that I've been with the commission and before that to help us with our work. So thanks, Michael. I'll stop there.
Alex, truly appreciate it, and Konrad as well. Extensive, excellent presentations. I've taken so many notes. There's a lot to follow up on. I know that we only have literally about 15 to 20 minutes left. I know we all have a hard stop at 1:15 Eastern Daylight Time, as we all have other events to go to this afternoon. To summarize all this would actually take another 15 or 20 minutes, but I'd like to pick up on just a few things that both you, Alex, and Konrad, that you had mentioned. And I think one of them overall is in terms of, Alex, what you had actually just said about the chairman of the Helsinki Commission, Senator Cardin, in terms of the United States leading with its values, okay? Leading with its values, and that what is being done right now in Congress with the initiative in Congress through the kleptocracy initiatives and various pieces of legislation. That is excellent. And this is, I think, from other people that we have heard from and interacted with, whether on Capitol Hill or our partners in Europe, is that everybody is looking for the United States to step up in terms of its clarity of purpose. What is the clarity of our purpose and leadership with our allies? We have a new administration for the last 10 months. This administration has extended its hand once again back to Europe to try to coalesce and get everybody back around the same values that have basically been staunch since the end of World War II. Looking at many people have mentioned before, in a sense, not to provoke Russia. And this is in a sense what Konrad had mentioned is to the extent of everything that was done, the preparations, what Russia had done for Zapad 21, for the activities that had happened within the Black Sea or are continuing to happen, the militarization of Crimea, and so forth and so on. I'm going to digress a little bit and disagree with something that our recorded message from Elisabeth. She said, don't try to predict what Russia is going to do next. I'm of the other philosophy that in a sense, we do know what Russia is going to do, and we ought to prepare ourselves for it as much as possible. General Ben Hodges, the former US European commander, basically in early spring and into the summer, as Russia was amassing its troops on Ukraine's border and preparing for the Zapad exercises, said he was extremely concerned about the narrative of what that is saying to the rest of the world. One aspect that I'd like the both of you to mention, I apologize for the long intro to the question, but one aspect that I would like the both of you to consider in answering this question is the informational domain. There is hybrid warfare that the Russians are doing. We understand the kinetic aspect, but there's also this disinformation and propaganda war, which is constantly coming out of the Kremlin. What do you see? What type of actions could our friends and allies in Europe, whether that is through NATO, whether that is through the EU, whether that is our participation within the OSCE, pursue in terms of combating this informational domain that Russia seems to be asserting itself more and more and more with their narrative and with their disinformation. How do you foresee us combating that, or what are some of the measures that we can do to help combat that?
Okay, I can take on that firstly. I'm going to talk about military perspective actually, because I analyzed Zapad 2017, maybe not to the extent that I did 2021, but I nevertheless, try to see what they were up to. And my impression was that there was really a lot of discussions going on 4 years ago about what Russia was trying to do and whether they will invade or not. There was also much more information about Russian movements. And to an extent, this fostered a conversation about Russian goals, not necessarily in the direction I hoped it would, because the discussion was that Russia would invade someone. It wasn't clear who, but the threat was there, partly driven by journalists as well. Whereas in 2021, from open source perspective, it was much more difficult to trace the Russian force units and which units they deployed to Belarus and which units they deployed to Russia and to which training ranges. And there was very little discussion, especially in Poland, as to what Russia was trying to do and what was the scale of this engagement, which to me was sort of ironic, because the scale of this year's Zapad was, in my view, much bigger than what they did 4 years ago. So to conclude, I think I would like to see more conversations going on about Russian military capabilities, or maybe not detailed discussions, but some discussions within think tanks and policy circles going to the public and to say, we keep track of what Russia is up to. We think it is this and this. But on the other hand, this necessitates some sort of objective analysis. And from what I've seen, sometimes it's quite difficult to obtain objectivity, especially when politicians have their own goals in mind. And I'm speaking mostly about Poland now. The second thing that I would like to see is the increased role of journalists, as I mentioned, in covering Russian military preparations or modernization or anything really that pertains to the Russian armed forces, because I think there is quite a lot of disinformation, misinformation, and sometimes it's just some things that appear on media are simply not true. And unfortunately, these things get picked up by public quite easily, and then it's just the snowball effect, and then I get questions all the time: will Russia invade or will it not invade? And that's partly because of the media. Sometimes they spin Russian narrative simply because they do not know how to deal with the inflow of information that's coming from the Kremlin about, for instance, the size of Russian military activity. And just the best example of that is the 200,000 troops that were scheduled to take part in this year's Zapad. 2,000 is really a lot of troops. My point of view is that it's highly unlikely that 200K were actually involved. However, if you include, the National Guard, forces in Southern Military District, all the logistics personnel, all the government agencies that and civil authorities that were involved in the long Zapad, then I think possibly 200,000 people may have been involved in Zapad. Thank you.
Alex.
Thanks, Michael. So Konrad, will they or won't they invade?
Right. I'm glad you asked that, because I was going to basically interject that.
Joking, of course. Look, disinformation is a huge question, and I actually would I would refer those in the audience who have a real deep interest in this to a hearing that the Helsinki Commission held just yesterday with the OSCE's representative on the freedom of the media, where this was discussed at some length. Senator Cardin, Senator Wicker, and Senator Shaheen, I think, were the principal questioners, and a lot of the discussion was around disinformation. It included some terrific witnesses in addition to the representative on freedom of the media. What we do about disinformation, I think, one, obviously, some of my takeaways from that hearing, supporting independent journalism everywhere, including at home, is absolutely crucial. And I think the more we lose access to independent journalism, the less we lose part of the lifeblood, not only of our strategic thinking, but also of democracy. Secondly, in terms of our posture of the United States looking abroad, I think institutions like RFERL, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, absolutely need our assistance and support. They have journalists who are harassed and attacked and jailed. Some of our close allies are harassed. The governments of close allies are harassing and jailing journalists. Senator Wicker was very eloquent in calling Turkey to account on that account in particular during our hearing. So supporting independent institutions, supporting independent journalists themselves. I think there's a part of this that has to do with education at home that I'm sure Elisabeth would have spoken to, having to do with her point on resilience. But I also think that there are a number of countries, in particular when we're thinking about Russia, that have long experience with this and are actually quite good at dealing with it, and that their populations are quite good at understanding what is real and what is not, in particular, and depending on where it's coming from. And here I really am thinking of our Baltic friends. I think a point you mentioned, General Ben Hodges, Michael, a point that I've heard him make, which I like very much, and I think that Konrad was echoing, was how pleased he was that with the incident in the Black Sea with the HMS Defender, there was a BBC reporter on board who could talk about exactly what was happening and talk about the jets that were flying overhead, and there was a cameraman, camera person, and it might have been that without that evidence, that the incident might have gone even more into a difficult situation. The last point I want to make on disinformation here, actually, again, is coming off of something that Konrad mentioned, which is the figures around Zapad, which are in either direction of where the Russians were describing them, preposterous in both directions. What I mean by that is Konrad mentioned this figure of 200,000 participants, which was something that to my understanding, was mentioned by several Russian governmental sources as kind of who is a part of this exercise. And that was, whether it was credible or not, it was a pretty sizable number. While at the very same time, the Russian government was reporting to the OSCE a number below 13,000, which, had they crossed the threshold of 13,000 troops participating in Zapad, they were obligated to invite a full set of observers from other OSCE participating states under their commitments under something called the Vienna document. So Konrad is much better placed than I am to say how many were participating in any element, and can we consider some short time period as opposed to a longer time period, and that changes the numbers. But I just want to underline the really grotesque difference between 12,800, let's say, and 200,000. Thanks.
Can I just get back to that?
Please,
because
please,
yeah,
yes.
So my understanding was that Belarus notified the OSCE that there will be 12,800 troops taking part in Zapad on Belarusian territory, involving both Russian and Belarusian troops, which was an understatement. I think there were. I think they said that 1,600 of them will be Russians, and I think I counted at least 4,000. But I was not aware of how much troops did actually Russia notify the OSCE would take part in Zapad. So it's unclear to me, what the figure actually of reported to the OSCE might have been. However, in 2018, I think Russia conducted the Vostok exercise, which was meant to be the largest exercise of since the end of the Cold War, and Russia then said that 300,000 people would take part in it. But last year, I think I found quite a credible source which said that actually the number was 35,000, around 35,000. So it's 10 times less, I think, than the official figure. I'm God no, I'm not saying that 20,000 people took 20,000 personnel took part in Zapad. It was definitely larger, but I don't think it was 200,000. At the very least, we are looking at every single unit in the Western military district being activated for the long Zapad, and of that we are looking at. I think it's fair to say that at least one battalion tactical group. Depending on which unit we are talking about, it ranges between 100 to 800 people.
Well, Konrad, we'll keep you on the line right now just to answer this one question that came into the chat. So there was a question in terms of if you could tell us what the makeup is of Russian forces within Kaliningrad. Obviously, we speak about a lot of what has happened in terms of its preparation and the actual exercises in Belarus for Zapad 2021, the Black Sea and what it's doing there. What is it doing in the enclave of Kaliningrad, and obviously anything dealing with the Baltic Sea?
Okay, so I think, frankly, I don't think we have enough time to discuss Kaliningrad, because I think I would need at least 40 minutes to fully discuss it. But let me talk about ground components and maybe air and air defense stuff if I have time. So on the ground, at the very, let's say, basic level, we are looking at three formations. We are looking at 11th Army Corps, which is a corps that is subordinated to the Baltic Sea Fleet Command, and it's tasked with defensive operations. Then we are looking at 11th Motor Rifle Division, which was established a couple of years ago. It has 2 motor rifle regiments and 1 tank regiment. The unit now has about 4,000 to 5,000 personnel, so it's very heavily under-strengthened. It would need at least to have 8,000 troops to be, fully capable. But Shoigu was promised, I think, 40,000 personnel in the next few years. So I think Kaliningrad is one of the manpower priorities. So, they will be trying to quickly populate these units with either new military personnel or with contract personnel. Now we are also looking at one independent motor rifle regiment, I think it's the 7th, which can be converted into a division. There is a lot of storage facilities in Kaliningrad as well. You know, Russia can bring in additional equipment, pieces of equipment from mainland Russia, and then when they start force generating, you can actually wake up with 2 motor rifle divisions, you know, in Kaliningrad, which is a lot. When it comes to air power, it's antiquated. Basically, we are looking at some Su-24Ms, Su-27s, and several Su-30SMs that were delivered to the Baltic Sea Fleet naval aviation a few years ago, but there really hasn't been a lot of movement when it comes to modernization of fixed wing capability in recent years, apart from the Su-30SMs. The word on the street is that, you know, the modernization will likely pick up this decade, but I am not so sure, because if you look at the deliveries of combat aircraft to the Russian Air Force in general, it's been plummeting quite heavily, and I think in 2020 they delivered something like 20 aircraft to the entire Air Force, which is a horrendous figure from the Russian point of view. When it comes to air defense, we are looking at 4 S-400 battalions deployed in coastal areas. They form the outer defense ring, and we are also looking at 2 S-300 battalions deployed inland, and they form the inner defense ring. It's very capable, integrated air defense system, and it's going to be very difficult to penetrate it from air. Unfortunately, from the Russian side, and fortunately from the NATO side, I mean, most of air defense assets in Kaliningrad can be destroyed by field artillery. The closest S-400 battalion in Kaliningrad is located 5 kilometers from the Polish border. You can essentially strike it with mortar fire, right? Let alone self-prepared artillery systems, which there are quite a few in Poland. So there is definitely some sort of a room to maneuver to burst the A2AD bubble in Kaliningrad. Yeah, and let me finish on this positive note.
Seeing that it's a very complicated issue, I think your summary in the past 3 minutes was absolutely wonderful. So we do appreciate that. This is being recorded, so everybody obviously can go back and review all this information. Karen, I don't know if we have any last questions for our panelists before we conclude this program.
We've sort of had a last minute surge of input. Yeah. So what I'm going to do is sort of read the questions that have come in the last few minutes, you know, and package them and let, you know, Alex and Konrad have one last chance to give their comments on those open issues, and then we'll wrap it up. Does that sound okay?
Please.
Okay, so one of the things that I wanted to ask about, and there's other interest in that too, is Alex, for the counter-kleptocracy legislation out there, what are some of the main points on that, and what can our audience do? Let's try to get them excited about helping get that passed, you know, what they can do in contacting their members of Congress as constituents. We've got some questions about Nord Stream 2. What are, you know, are there plans for cooperation between the US and its Central and East European partners in ensuring regional energy security, especially in the aftermath of Nord Stream 2's completion, and on assuring the continued use of Ukrainian gas pipelines, given its, you know, Russian influence on natural gas prices. And then shifting to the Georgia question, with respect to whether or not Russia will invade, it's worth reminding that in 2008, all the analysts were sure that Russia would not invade Georgia, but it did. And Georgia keeps losing its land every day. And then also, is anybody in the international community monitoring the Russian military movements in Georgian regions, Abkhazia and South Ossetia? So, right, thanks to everyone for sending those questions in, and I'll let you guys, let our panelists address those and wrap things up.
Whoever would like to begin first, maybe Alex, if you
Sure,
like.
yeah, I think a number of these are headed my way in the minute or so we have left. So counter kleptocracy with excuses to my good friend and colleague Paul Massaro, who really is the driving force on these from our commission at the staff level. I think from our chairman's perspective, the leadership that was demonstrated on enacting Magnitsky sanctions is very much a model. The revolution that came from the Magnitsky sanctions in terms of targeting individual human rights abusers that was then expanded to a global Magnitsky regime, I think very much is the model for how we can use targeted measures to get after the miscreants, as opposed to people who aren't necessarily responsible. And so I think there's a package of 6 or 7 different bills that you can find more information on our website, csce.gov, as well as the formation of a counter kleptocracy caucus that are all, they're all intended to address what I understand to be a kind of broad approach that has to do with identifying, exposing, and targeting individuals who are a part of this kleptocratic class that's undermining democracy and the rule of law, broadly speaking, across the OSCE space. I think one very important part of this that our chairman speaks very eloquently about, and Senator Whitehouse as well, another of our commissioners, is the need to get our own house in order as well in the United States on some of these issues. Nord Stream 2, I have some of the same questions, and I don't think I have a satisfying answer for you on where that's going, frankly. At Georgia, I would only point out one of the difficulties that the international community faces in Georgia is precisely the added value of the OSCE was taken away by a Russian veto of the continued mission of Georgia, the continued mission of the OSCE in Georgia. Maybe I'll leave it at that, and Konrad, if you have some thoughts.
Great, Konrad, yes, please.
So when it comes to the 2008 war in Georgia, let me just go to something. Before the invasion of Georgia in 2008, Russia conducted the Kafkas 2008 exercise, which officially ended on the 4th of August, a week before. And I quote, a sustained Georgian artillery attack struck the town of Sawkiw in South Ossetia. Sorry. So unfortunately, the way it works, it seems for Russia, is that, you know, sometimes, quite often when they go to war, it's from their point of view reactive rather than proactive. They made it quite clear that they will defend its interests in South Ossetia and Abkhazia. And also from what I know, Condoleezza Rice went to Georgia in the summer of 2008, and she said quite clearly, Russia is trying to lure you into a trap. Do not fall for it. And unfortunately, this what happened, and Russia deployed its troops to protect its interests. And they will continue to do so, whether it's Ukraine, unfortunately, or whether it's Belarus.
We saw what happened, obviously, in the Transnistria region, applied itself to Georgia, applied itself to Ukraine. And that's why, again, what Elisabeth had noticed or had mentioned earlier is it's hard to predict what Russia will do next. I'm of the adage that it's easy to predict what Russia will do next, but that, again, is just my personal opinion. Thank you. Thank you to our panelists for a truly most enlightening discussion. You've given us much food for thought and a lot of good homework to do as well. So we'll be monitoring and observing all realms of continued Russian aggression, and hope to reconvene at a later time to compare notes and to seek additional counsel. I'd like to also thank our audience members for your participation and your questions. It was a truly wonderful and thought-provoking discussion. So, and a big thank you to the Central and East European Coalition team who made this possible behind the scenes. Karen, Klara, Veronica, Carl, and others, thank you. With that, have a wonderful day, have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you at our next event. Until then, take care. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.